Hello, this is your host Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. I'm again joined by Keith Preston. This time we're doing a bit of a special episode. We're not doing it on Thursday because of Thanksgiving, which is when I'd normally stream. And I'm bringing on Keith to talk about Nietzsche because when we first engaged each other, 2013, 2014, almost 10 years ago, Nietzsche was, kind of one of the things that you were known for, this sort of a Nietzschean Sternright anarchist. And that kind of got you into trouble. People called you fascist for that. So why don't you describe to us why Nietzsche's important, how you found Nietzsche, what you've read from Nietzsche and what you think his big message is.
Well, I first discovered Nietzsche, I guess I first heard of him when I was in my teens. I think I was probably about 17 when I first heard of him. You usually negatively, hearing people speak of him negatively. I don't think I ever read anything he wrote or read much about him until I was probably in my early 20s when I was about the age of being a college undergrad. And at the time, there were different takes on Nietzsche. You had the people who said, well, Nietzsche was a Nazi or a proto-Nazi. And then you had others that said that, no, Nietzsche was actually a cool hipster. If he were here today, he'd be the term woke wasn't in vogue back then, but if he were here today, he'd be a hip progressive. And then, of course, you had the religious critique of Nietzsche. He's like an atheist and a blasphemer and all of that. And I don't recall getting that deep into Nietzsche back then. I remember trying to read some of his stuff and I didn't understand it. So I just kind of moved on past it. And I would read commentary on Nietzsche by other people, and which I didn't find very interesting because it was usually just the kind of stuff I described. So I didn't think much about Nietzsche for a while until probably about 10 years later. I started becoming interested in critics of modernity. And one of the reasons for that was I was always hearing everyone say, well, modern society, modern liberal democratic capitalist society is the best there ever is, or the best there could ever be, or the apex of human civilization. And this was, sometime after the end of history thesis by Fukuyama had already become in vogue. And it was the 90s, when American hegemony, unipolar hegemony was certainly unquestioned. And this idea of, liberal democracy is on the march worldwide was pretty much in vogue at the time, this whole end of history, Washington consensus theme. So I became interested, being a contrarian that I am, in critics of modernism, or critics of liberalism, or critics of democracy, or critics of capitalism, obviously. So I started looking back into some of these anti-modernist thinkers and trying to figure out what their views were. For example, the idea of what did critics of the Enlightenment say as it was emerging, or what did critics of classical liberalism say as it was emerging, or industrialization or modernization? And Nietzsche is probably foremost among those. Of any of those kinds of thinkers, he's probably one of the most interesting and insightful, and probably one of the most influential overall. I eventually wrote a book called Thinkers Against Modernity that has a collection of biographical profiles in it of these different anti-modernist thinkers, of which Nietzsche is one. And I've also written about Nietzsche in other contexts. I've contributed to some of Troy Southgate's compilations. I've contributed to quite a few of those, but he's had some on themes related to Nietzsche that I've contributed to. I've also written on Nietzsche in ways it's been published in other venues, mostly webzines. And there are works on Nietzsche in some of my other books, as well as on my Substack page. If you go to that, there's some essays on Nietzsche there. If you go to Attack the System, there's some work. Go through use the search mechanism, you can find work on Nietzsche as well. So I've written a number of pieces on Nietzsche and his influence.
What would you say is Nietzsche's main point? Because from my reading of Nietzsche, in certain regards, he's like Marx. So Marx famously said at the end of his life, he wasn't here to build a system, but to build a method of critique and that he should be saved from his own followers. The idea being that Marxism was meant to be an analytical method to deconstruct capitalism rather than necessarily a body of thought that becomes dogmatic. Now, I think now Nietzsche's not criticizing capital here, but I think Nietzsche is like Marx in that sense. He's not giving you a body of thought, say like Plato, who he strongly dislikes, to something else, which is to get rid, to deconstruct what he doesn't like, and that seems to me everything after the Bronze Age, basically. So what would you say? Is that basically his point, or what would you add to that?
Well, Nietzsche is a critic of modernity in the sense that he sees modern civilization as a deterioration from what he considers to be the superior values of antiquity. If you look back and look, if you read what he actually wrote, among his idols, I don't know if idols is the right term, among the historical figures that he pointed to as great men were figures like Alexander, Julius Caesar, Napoleon. He also cited Napoleon. And what do these guys all have in common? They were world historical figures. They were civilizational changing figures. It was Alexander who spread Hellenism throughout the ancient Mediterranean and ancient Near East. It was Rome that was, this vast imperial expanse that brought the Greco-Roman civilization to the world. Napoleon, the same. He's the one that brought the Enlightenment to throughout Europe. And that's the kind of thing that Nietzsche admired. He admired figures that were world historical in terms of their impact. And he thought that the ethos of modernity was one that would undermine the thriving of these kinds of personalities. It's somewhat similar to some of the critiques of modernity that you see among more traditional conservatives, where they will say that, well, or maybe not conservatives as a term, maybe reactionaries. They will say that the problem with modernity is that everything is rationalized, everything is scientific, everything is empirical, everything is quantifiable, and that removes the mystery from existence, or that removes the mystification of life, or that it removes sacralization and all of these kinds of things. And as a result, humans have nothing to aspire to. It undermines the concept of heroism and aspirationalism in that sense. For example, when you think about the Roman soldiers, when they would go into battle, they would say, for those about to die, we salute you. Like the sort of the glorification of heroism in battle and that kind of thing. Whereas nobody's going to go to battle saying, for those about to die, we salute you in the name of neoliberalism, or the gross national product, or something like that. And Nietzsche is a thinker in this genre as well. He's obviously somewhat different from a lot of your standard anti-modernists in other ways, but he's certainly within this kind of genre. He thought that modernity and the ethos of modernity and the demystification of life and desacralization and things like that not only undermined the thriving of like an aspirational personality, the Apollonian Dionysian dichotomy, but he also thought on a collective level it undermined high culture. And again, this is something else you'll hear from a lot of more traditional people, traditional conservatives. They will say, well, they'll talk, for example, about the loss of religious faith in modern culture, and they'll say, look, ancient and medieval people built these great temples and cathedrals and all this monumental stuff in the name of religious faith. But if you don't have religious faith, what are you going to build? And they'll point to the comparative blandness of, say, modern architecture or something like that, or modern art, in response to all of the classical art, classical architecture. That's just one example, but that's something Nietzsche was concerned about, was how modernity would have the effect um, of undermining the ability of human beings to produce this kind of high culture. So this, so the lack of heroism associated with modernism, the lack of high culture. And parallel to that was Nietzsche's critique of mass society and egalitarianism. And he argued that the problem with egalitarianism, like mass democracy, socialism, these kinds of things, is that it doesn't elevate the lower, the mediocre to the level of the great. In fact, it does just the opposite. It celebrates mediocrity, and it reduces everything down to the level of the mediocre. It brings down what is superior rather than uplifting what is inferior. That's a standard Nietzschean critique. Another issue was Nietzsche's view of metaphysics. He rejected not only traditional religion, which he's famous for, but also traditional Western metaphysics, like Plato and that kind of stuff. He went back to the pre-Socratics. That was really his, like the sophist and that kind of thing. And Nietzsche was very much a forerunner to what is today called postmodernism. Like if you look at 20th century philosophy, particularly the post-war period, like if you look at existentialism, for instance, like Jean-Paul Sartre, or if you look at postmodern thinkers that came out of France in the post-war period, like Foucault and all of that kind of stuff, that's very Nietzschean. Those and they may take it in a somewhat different direction than he did, but but the foundation of it is certainly very Nietzschean. But what Nietzsche believed is that due to the loss of traditional Western metaphysics, or due to the loss of traditional Western religion, which he thought had been undermined by science and things like that, the result is that values are simply subjective. Like there's, for example, there's no such thing as truth in an absolute sense. I mean, he might have thought there was truth in a sense. If you throw a rock in the air, it'll fall back down. But there's no such thing as moral truth or metaphysical truth or truth. Like a lot of moral realists, for example, will say things like, we know that there's a transcendent morality that's either created by God or inherent in nature or something of that nature, some sort of metaphysical view of ethics, virtue, right and wrong, good and evil. And of course, one of Nietzsche's famous books was Beyond Good and Evil, meaning that there's really no such thing other than just individual preferences and perceptions and attitudes, or maybe some collective values and social constructs and that kind of stuff. And he thought that this was actually a problem. He's a lot of critics of Nietzsche, particularly religious traditionalists, view him as somebody who was more like, they think he was someone like more Marquis de Sade, somebody who believed that, well, do what thou wilt, everyone should just be as transgressive or predatory or, morally bankrupt as they could possibly be. I think it was Dostoevsky that said, well, if God is dead, everything is permitted, or something like that. And Nietzsche is thought of as being a glorifier of this way of thinking. But that's not really what he was getting at when he was talking about the death of God. He was talking about how actually the unmooring of, say, traditional values, cultural tradition, historic tradition, religious faith, metaphysical philosophy, objective ethics, all of the unmooring of all of these things is actually a problem, because these were the things that stitched societies together. And if you don't have these anymore, well, what are you going to do? You're all of a sudden, it's like you're in a boat with no sail and no anchor. You're just kind of drifting with the boat. So what are you going to do now? And he thought that was the condition that Western civilization was in within the context of modernity. And he was thought that this was a crisis that would continue to unfold over time, which it has. And so I think that really is the essence of some of Nietzsche's main arguments. There's a huge number of ways in which Nietzsche is misinterpreted. The obvious one is that he's a forerunner to the Nazis. What that seems to be based on is, one, he was a German. Two, his sister really was a Nazi. She tried to misappropriate his work for that purpose. Certainly, the Third Reich tried to do the same. But if you look at what he actually believed about politics, he wasn't really a political philosopher per se. He didn't have a prescribed political system or something of that nature. But he was not fond of the rising German nationalism of the late 19th century. Like we're talking about the Bismarck era, which is where he lived. In fact, if anything, he thought it was left wing. He thought that Bismarckian nationalism was egalitarianism. He thought nationalism was about elevating the masses, and he thought it was similar to socialism and things like that. He was not that big on militarism, despite his admiration of figures like Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar. He was not an anti-Semite. In fact, had been friends with the composer Richard Wagner, and actually broke with Wagner because of Wagner's anti-Semitism. So Nietzsche was not an anti-Semite. He was not a German nationalist. He was not any of the things that are definitive characteristics of National Socialism. As far as his political philosophy, he seems to have been more like a traditional aristocratic conservative. Obviously not a religious conservative, but more of a Roman-style aristocratic conservatism. Where religion may be part of the civic infrastructure, but it's not the central focus of the society, as it was, say, in a medieval period. I think if Nietzsche could be classified in any way politically, he was that kind of a traditional conservative. And again, he wrote about one of his books was Beyond Good and Evil. That's very much a forerunner to modern subjectivist views of ethics and postmodernism, and he's often characterized as a nihilist as well. And he was not necessarily a nihilist. I don't necessarily see him as a pessimist, for example. Or I think he seems to have been someone who thought that the task of modern people was the recreation of civilization and what he called the transvaluation of values, meaning basically creating your own values, based on aspirational ideals. And you find some of this in some of the later existentialist thinkers, like Jean-Paul Sartre, for example. Jean-Paul Sartre was interesting because existentialism is very Nietzschean, but then the direction Sartre took that in was he became a communist. He became a militant communist. I think he was a Maoist at one point. I know he belonged to the French Communist Party, which I don't think Nietzsche would have approved.
He also fell out of favor with Camus over the French Algerians because Camus sided with them in the civil war in Algeria.
Right. Yeah. But Sartre's philosophy is very Nietzschean, not so much as politics. Foucault was the same way. Foucault was very much a Nietzschean. He went in the same kind of direction. He became a Maoist. I think he was in the Communist Party of France at one point as well, and then he went beyond that. And then he was sort of a forerunner to some of our queer theory and that kind of stuff that we have now. But then there was also Heidegger. Heidegger was very influenced by Nietzsche. Of course, he at least famously joined the Nazi Party, at least for a time, perhaps opportunistically. And you also have a lot of far right thinkers from the 20th century that claim to be influenced by Nietzsche, like Julius Evola and a lot of figures like that. So I think that goes to show that you can't really derive one political philosophy from Nietzsche directly. His way of thinking is actually similar to Marx in that it's more of a critique. I mean, if you look at the history of Marxism, you see you have the classical Marxist, and then you've got the social democrats, and then you've got the Marxist-Leninist and Marxist-Leninist Maoist, and neo-Marxist and Frankfurt School and libertarian socialist and all these other things. And the Nietzschean family tree is very similar. It's got this whole spectrum of thought, postmodernism, Evolan traditionalism, National Socialism, fascism, queer theory, all of that kind of stuff is on the Nietzschean family tree. And I'm pretty sure much of that is stuff Nietzsche himself would not have approved of.
So there's a point that I think is really important to unpack here. And I think it was, let me look up Nietzsche's list of works here. It was one of his later works. He says in Ecce Homo that the Christian critics are the only people that understand him, which is interesting, which is why he was included in Yaroslav Pelikan's Fools for Christ, because Pelikan was picking historical figures who represented an understanding of Christianity. And he chose Nietzsche because Nietzsche rejected it, but he argued that what he was rejecting was something that was correctly defined. But let's see, where can I find his works? It was near the end of his life, but he said that in one of his discussions, you can't, to a fellow atheist, you can't say that you're an atheist and you have all, you just minus Yahweh, minus God, minus Jesus, but then you have all of these moral inheritances from, it might have been, here, Twilight of the Idols. It's in Twilight of the Idols. He says you can't actually inherit all that from Christianity. It's not derived from reason alone. In fact, the Bible would say you can't derive it from reason alone. So in that regard, of course, Nietzsche is critiquing fellow atheists for not taking this process far enough. And I brought that up in our first interaction. But the other thing is, when Nietzsche talks about the loss of moral values, some of the stuff that he writes, which, taken in isolation, can seem to support some pretty horrible things, like in, let's see, where were we here? The Birth of Tragedy we have, where he says, to speak of right and wrong per se makes no sense. No act of violence, rape, exploitation, destruction is intrinsically unjust. Just life itself is violent, rapacious, exploitative, and destructive, cannot be conceived as otherwise. And then I won't read it all, in The Gay Science, he has the man and the priest says, well, kill this kid because his life is miserable. Kind of sounds like a quality of life argument from a modern liberal. And then he goes and The Will to Power, for example, one place, he talks about the biblical injunctions against thou shalt not are itself immorality because they go against the natural impulse. That goes back to Socrates and Plato versus the Athenian sophists. But so is he, in the sort of a Machiavellian sense, a quote teacher of evil, or is this a descriptive or a prescriptive thing, right? Because if we look at the stage of European civilization he was in, one could say descriptively, yeah, that's where things are going. And he might use colorful language to get people's attention. But is he also being descriptive, as if that's what he thinks reality is or should be? Because that's how I was raised reading Nietzsche. Is that how would you do that?
Well, that's a common theological critique of Nietzsche, particularly from a Christian perspective. But no, I think that he's more describing the implications of modern thought. It's not that he's necessarily saying that everyone should become Marquis de Sade or something like that. He's saying that, well, ultimately, once you lose all of these other things, these cultural moorings, tradition, historical practice, theology, metaphysics, objective morals, these kinds of things. Once you lose all of that, then ultimately, who's to say what's wrong with, say, raping somebody? Now, that doesn't mean he necessarily thought you should go and rape somebody. Marquis de Sade probably would have said, yeah, that's what you should do. But I don't think that's necessarily Nietzsche's perspective. At least there's no evidence of that. He's simply saying this is a dilemma. He's describing this as a problem. Not as advocacy, but he's saying, okay, what's really wrong with raping somebody? And then, and modern ethicists and social theorists and all political philosophers deal with this issue too, because they'll say, well, what's really wrong with this, that, or the other thing, and then the position that typically comes out of that, well, there's some will embrace naturalistic ethics, but then others will talk about utilitarian ethics, or they'll talk about just mere consequentialism. Well, for society to function, we can't have everybody going around raping everybody else. So we've got to have cultural and moral and legal and political prescriptions against that for pragmatic reasons. But I think that, but in many traditional cultures, as we know, values were thought of as metaphysical, or they were thought of as theological or divinely inspired, or bare minimum naturalistic, like even in the U.S. founding documents, they have this kind of naturalistic nature and nature's God and that kind of thing. But without all of that, there's this issue of, well, why shouldn't everyone just be Marquis de Sade? So Nietzsche's describing this as a dilemma, and not just for the implications of this of modern thought for ethics and personal values and behavior and that kind of thing. I think more importantly than that, I think he's thinking about uh, the, on the collective level. When for instance, in a medieval society, everything was very stratified and ordered. You've got God at the top, and you've got the king or the pope, who's like the representatives of God in the secular realm or in the church, and then you've got a layered system of social stratification in terms of the church hierarchy and the royal feudal hierarchy and all of these kinds of things. Well, all of this stuff had been uprooted by modernity. We've been focusing a lot on philosophy and metaphysics and religion and morals and all that, but social structures as well had been uprooted by modernity. So you didn't have this world of the Middle Ages where everybody just has their place as people commonly thought of. Instead, you have this world where everything is in flux. Everything is moving very, very rapidly. The 19th century, the late 19th century, when Nietzsche was writing, is very, very similar to right now. It was a time of very rapid technological development, very rapid economic development, very rapid social change, very rapid loss of more traditional or older values or institutions or social relationships and all of that kind of stuff. The 19th century is very similar to now, and Nietzsche's critiquing this as it's happening. He's saying, well, all right, we don't really have this sense of identity we once had. We don't have this sense of the absolute or the concrete or it's there's been this loss of identity. There's been this loss of sense of meaning or purpose or direction. And along with that, things like values, morals, all of these kinds of things. And in fact, he was actually very critical of some of the rising movements of his own time because he saw these as just simply ways of addressing the crisis of modernity as he understood it, or ways of evading the crisis of modernity. Like he looked at things like socialism, nationalism, religion, utopianism, all of the kinds of movement, intellectual currents that were around in the late 19th century. And he thought, well, these are just modern religions. These are just, and a lot of critics of modernity will talk about this. They'll talk about how a lot of modern thought is just a secularization of older ways of thinking, secular Christianity or secular Platonism or something like that. And Nietzsche thought a lot of modern political movements and ideologies and social currents were that. They were sort of an effort to create a more secular or modern version of older philosophies. Classic example would have been the reinvention of Christianity as a struggle against slavery and social injustice. Like abolitionism and the social gospel and progressive Christianity. In fact, you even had Nietzsche is widely known for his atheism, but there's also a branch of modern Christian theology called Christian existentialism, which is very heavily derived from Nietzsche. If you go back and you read theologians from the 19th and early 20th century, particularly Europeans, like certainly Kierkegaard is an early one, but then later if you start reading like Tillich and Bultmann and Barth and people like that, a lot of that is very Nietzschean. Because that's what they're doing. These are modern theologians that are responding to some of the questions raised by Nietzsche. And that's what the Christian tradition, existentialist tradition, emerges out of. And that's yet another branch of Nietzschean thought, along with Nietzschean Maoism and Nietzschean queer theory and Nietzschean Nazism, and it's.
I think this is actually an important point to jump in here. Is Nietzsche does leave this kind of open-ended life, or this sort of like open shutter where do we go next? Because one of the things that, at least practically, maybe not content of thought-wise, Nietzsche is similar to Marxist revolutionaries and anarchists, is that in the Catechism of a Revolutionary, we read that Nechayev punts really bad. He says, On the attitude of society toward the people, paragraph 24. With this end in view, the society therefore refuses to impose any new organization from above. Any future organization will doubtless work its way through the movement and life of the people, but that is a matter for future generations to decide. Our task is total, universal, and merciless destruction. Marx had a similar opinion after the failed revolt in Paris in the Paris Commune in 1871. But the thing is, let's say you have a future society in mind and you want to get there. And of course, socialism is attempting to build a new society, even if maybe Marx wasn't. At least Marx was pointing to that, at least in his own mind. The idea being, though, that if you don't have some sort of mark that you're at least aiming for, you're not going to get there. And that seems to be a lot of the problems we've seen with historic socialism, is that they're very good at destroying what's around them, but not so good at building something to replace it. Nietzsche said, I believe it was in Twilight of the Idol, or Thus Spoke Zarathustra, that the audience he was waiting for didn't exist yet, and that future generations would have to finish the work he started. But again, that sounds a lot, performatively, it sounds a lot like what I just read from Nietzsche. So then the question is, when Nietzsche died, where would you say he was, and where do you think he thought things were going? Right before other people took his work and then used it, where do you think he thought things were going, just using the works that he had?
Well, he seemed to hint at the idea, at least, that in the 20th century there would be tremendous clashes between ideological forces that were trying to essentially find a replacement for traditional culture, and which more or less anticipates the world wars and the Cold War and all of that. I mean, that's what that is. You had these modern religions, like Nazism, communism, liberal democracy, that are each battling it out to maintain dominance and find their place in the world in the 20th century. But Nietzsche thought it would be the 21st century before people really came into confrontation with the crisis of nihilism, or with the crisis of modernity, which is where we are now, obviously. And right now, like I said, it's very similar to the 19th century. Only we've now got digital technology and nuclear weapons and artificial intelligence and all of this kind of stuff as well. And we've already been through the world wars. But I don't see Nietzsche as necessarily a pessimist, though. Like I said, I think he had this optimistic view that people of the future would essentially become the Übermensch, or at least some would, in the sense of they creating their own aspirational ideals and engaging in self-overcoming, as he would have called it.
Right. So the other thing that's, I guess, sort of, again, related to this is Nietzsche seems to be saying that since the old religions, the old philosophies no longer hold purchase, I guess there's two ways you could look at this. He's on the one hand either saying that, well, it's just a matter of fact, they don't hold purchase on people's minds anymore, or it could be just a prescriptive claim that you shouldn't actually believe in those things anymore, specifically Christianity. And I think you could make that, and Plato, you could probably make that case. But then you find within yourself or within nature, because I know he likes Heraclitus a lot, the idea of constant flux, the idea that that's how we derive value. But you see, I don't know. That to me just seems like he's not finished. It seems like, because even if you appeal to nature, even if you appeal to human experience, you then have to ask a second question. How do you contextualize what you're experiencing, what you're living? And then how do you do that? Because what I'm not understanding with Nietzsche's thought is self-overcoming to what? So let's use a religious tradition like a monk, right? You have a certain state of, whether you're Buddhist or Catholic, right? You have a certain state of mind and spirituality that you are trying to achieve through self-overcoming, through ritual. Now, they have an idea of where they're going and where they want to be. Now, whether they get there or not, whether it's possible or not, is a whole nother question. But at least they have this target in mind. Nietzsche seems to be like that, but without actually giving you a destination. And to me, that's just really confusing.
Well, I think his issue is you have to pick your own. You have to become who you are. That's another one of his phrases. So he can't really prescribe it for you. You've got to find it for yourself. that gets to another idea in Nietzsche that's often misinterpreted, and that's this idea of eternal recurrence. Like some people interpret that to actually think, well, Nietzsche believed in reincarnation or had some kind of metaphysical view about the circular nature of history or something. I think that's an overstatement. That's just the idea of eternal recurrence seems to be more of a thought experiment, where if you had to live your life over and over and over again, repeatedly, forever, would you want to live the current life that you've lived over and over again infinitely? Meaning, have you lived your best life? Have you been the best you could be? Would you? Is this what you would want to do again, and another life, and then again, and then again? Yeah, it's so again that gets back to this idea of become who you are, or self overcoming, which is about aspiring to this, this Ubermensch status.
Well, then this gets into another question. So in C.S. Lewis's The Abolition of Man, he says that in man's triumph over nature through science and technology, nature has triumphed over man. And what he means by that is by believing that we are these purely materialistic, mechanistic, scientific creatures, we ignore our what Freud would call the id, our emotions, our passions, our desires. And then once we strip away any rational process to distinguish between the two, all we're left with is the strongest impulse. So whichever impulse is stronger is going to be one that governs the user of any given technology. So the question that I would see with someone like Nietzsche, or even existentialism, which grows out of Nietzsche, is which best self? Because depending on which desire you lean into, which a part of your fragmented self you lean into, you could be very different. And even if we're going to argue from a sort of hedonic point of view that you want to be your best self, well, is your best self that leans really hard into sensual pleasures? Is your best self someone that leans really hard into mental pleasures? Are you even capable of determining that yourself? All these kinds of questions, at least from my understanding, Nietzsche doesn't really get into, which I think makes it confusing and difficult to understand.
I suspect he would have said there's no answer to that. It's up to you. You got to do it on your own and find your own way. Yeah.
Well, I mean, in a sense,
he probably would have said something like, "Well, if becoming who you are just means you're going to take a maximum amount of opioids, whatever, to eventually overdose," he probably would have said, "No, that's not, aspiring to. That's not self-overcoming. That's not, that's not becoming who you are. Or maybe it is, but so no, I mean, I don't think that he would have postulated that as some kind of ideal."
Right. And so the ideal, though, because within any given self, right, he's like the heroic self. He likes the Caesar, the Napoleon.
Right.
And he wants to see people aspire more to that rather than like a Desadian sense, if we go with what you're saying.
Right.
But, I mean, is this derived? It seems to be derived from a certain understanding of nature. Because one of the things that Nietzsche seems to rail against is the idea of the Weltgeist, the idea of the world beyond sight, which he blames on Plato and then later Paul, and just kind of has this whole post-Socratic critique. But the thing is, though, can you really determine anything absent of Weltgeist, right? Is he actually asking you to do something that's possible? Because what if it's the case that you need a Weltgeist of some kind to... So think about it this way. If you have any number of choices to make, say food, you want to eat, you're going to have to just choose at some point because you're going to starve if you keep waiting around. So you're going to have some other mechanism to make that choice before you actually eat something if you have, like, say, a buffet to choose from. And so for me, it's like, well, okay, but absent of Weltgeist that sort of orders your perceptions, how do you choose? Like, that's even more fundamental.
That's one of the questions I think he was getting at. He was pointing to that dilemma and basically saying there's no answer.
All right. Yeah. Well, that's one of the reasons why I'm very unsatisfied with Nietzsche, because I like a philosopher that builds a framework, like, say, a Plato or an Aristotle. But because that's the problem. What is he on about, right? Because as you said, there's this huge, vast family tree of people that say, well, we're the real Nietzscheans, and that's very confusing. And then you've got Nietzsche critics, which are also confusing. And so, okay, well, what exactly is this about? what exactly is Nietzsche trying to do here? Because one of the things is he also interacts a lot with Schopenhauer, and they're often seen as pairs in philosophical studies. And so with Schopenhauer, you have the idea that he's very life denying. He's trying to build a kind of like a rationalized Christian worldview, right? Christian ethics and morality from pure reason, which of course Nietzsche doesn't like very much. But he doesn't like the Christian morality as a whole either. So, so in that case, yeah, what if somebody's self-overcoming though is just becoming like a Buddhist monk or becoming, a Christian ascetic? I mean, how would that not be self-overcoming?
Well, I think in many ways that being something like that would be compatible with Nietzschean thought. Um, and it's interesting how I know in the 1960s, for instance, there was Nietzsche was popular among a lot of countercultural intellectuals in the 1960s. And that's how you kind of get these left Nietzscheans. But it was also true that during that same time there was a growing interest in mysticism, and as well as in Eastern religion, as well as even in certain types of Christian spirituality, like Christian primitivism and that kind of stuff. Um, so I don't know that that's necessarily non-Nietzschean. In fact, Sartre himself even hinted at that. He said, "Well, we may have to create our own values, but then." If that's the case, why not be a militant communist, or something or other? Um, Although you could argue that being a Marxist is kind of like being a secularized Christian or a secularized Platonist, because it has this framework of dialectical materialism and all of that. So being like a Buddhist monk or a Christian ascetic might actually be even more Nietzschean. Like what did Nietzsche say about Christ? He said the last Christian died on the cross. So he's sort of postulating that as, that's an ideal of like self-overcoming, in a way.
Yeah, it's true. He did say that. The other thing with this broader critique of the Western intellectual tradition that Nietzsche is associated with is, and this to me has always been a sort of a bugbear for me. He argues that, so the Romans and later Western tradition argues that you should tell the truth. So in the Aeneid, after one of the Greek tragedians pretends that the Greeks have left him behind, they take pity on him, bring him into Troy, and then the horse comes in, it's all over. And they're like, yeah, these lying Greeks. And Nietzsche's like, no, the lying Greeks are great. Plato, but so this is what I'm confused about. Now, maybe it's just the guy I've been watching. I told you about this guy, Weltgeist. And he said that he views this idea of a Weltgeist as this imbued source of truth that later becomes Christianity and organized religion. But Plato himself did not believe that truth was the ideal. In the Republic, he literally bases his entire political theory on the noble lie. He has the idea of the lottery of, which is the idea to breed essentially super soldiers. You have the best people breed, and then you create the disguise as a lottery. So does Nietzsche actually say that? Does he actually say that Plato represents this kind of commitment to truth? Because I don't really see it.
No, one thing about Nietzsche that you have to keep in mind when looking at those questions is he was very much an elitist. He was not an egalitarian. If he were here today, he probably wouldn't be, very woke in a lot of his opinions, because he didn't necessarily think that the masses at large could aspire to what he's talking about. When he talks about the Ubermensch, he's talking about individuals that are capable of rising above, the herd of humanity and aspiring to greatness beyond mediocrity. He's very big on excellence. He's very big on the superior. He very much has a great man theory of history, which was a fairly common viewpoint, even in Nietzsche's time, from among historians and interpreters of history and things like that. So he wasn't necessarily saying that, well, in the future everybody's going to be an Ubermensch. In fact, one reason that he was somewhat skeptical of egalitarian movements was he thought that, as I said earlier, he thought it brought the great down to the level of the inferior rather than uplifting the inferior. But parallel to that, and that's a very pre-modern, conservative, or I don't know if conservative is the word, traditionalist or medieval view of society. That there's some people who are just natural elites and some people who are natural inferiors, and some are born to be servants, and that's just how it is. And he seems to have held to a viewpoint like that, or something approaching it. And this is somewhat speculative. I can't say this is exactly Nietzsche's view of someone like Plato, but my guess would be that Nietzsche would probably view the Platonic idea of a noble lie as not necessarily ignoble, because it may be something that is necessary to keep the herd, together and keep the herd from, going off and going too wild and doing its own thing, but in a way that allows the superior individual to rise above the herd. Uh, and this kind of thinking was common even among a lot of the philosophers, even among a lot of Enlightenment thinkers. Like, for example, I think it was Voltaire that said that, well, if God didn't exist, it would be necessary to invent God, because we need God to keep the rabble in line and keep them from going crazy and creating mayhem, and having a sense of right. Ordinary people need to have a sense of right and wrong that they're not going to get from contemplation and meditation and all of that. So it's got to be inculcated in them by institutions and by these kind of rudimentary moral teachings, thou shalt not steal and that kind of stuff. And I suspect Nietzsche would have had that kind of outlook as well. So he would have probably said that even though traditional Western metaphysics or traditional religions like Christianity, he may not believe in them in a factual sense, but he might say they're noble lies that have served to keep the herd in line, so to speak, or at least keep society functioning in a cohesive sense and not just fragment into warring bandits doing their own thing.
So I think the last question I have for you then is, if we take some of the more moral anti-realist statements, like some of the ones I referred to earlier, as descriptive of where the Europe was at the time, rather than descriptive, once we get to the point he's talking about of this age where overmen overcome all this, is that going to lead to a restoration of moral realism or not? Is it going to be something else? Did you see what I'm saying?
Well, that was one of the questions I think he was interested in, and that's one of the big questions that interpreters of Nietzsche are certainly interested in. When the crisis of modernity or the crisis of nihilism is overcome, if it's overcome, what's going to happen? What's going to come next? And that's kind of where we are now. I mean, if we culturally, if we look at intellectual culture in its present form, we see that now postmodernism, which is a direct descendant of Nietzsche, is pretty much the dominant paradigm, certainly among intellectuals, or might as well be. But at the same time, interestingly, parallel to that, you have these different moral frameworks that a lot of elite intellectuals hold to that aren't necessarily derivative of this kind of postmodern thought. Like, I hear a lot of people that are critics of the left, like Jordan Peterson. They'll talk about how, well, you've got this postmodern cultural Marxism. Well, that has nothing to do with, cultural Marxism has nothing to do with postmodernism. Rather, when you see that people who implicitly have this postmodern philosophical framework, but then this kind of left-wing, modern Western style left-wing moral framework. For example, the view that racism and sexism are the ultimate evils. Like someone like Richard Rorty, he's a postmodern philosopher, and he's also a leftist, and he epitomizes this. He's on one hand, he's like this postmodern, radical moral skeptic or subjectivist or whatever. But on the other hand, he'll talk about how it's the role of university professors to help students overcome their biases against homosexuals or something like that. Well, if you really take postmodernism and moral skepticism seriously, why do you care if students have biases against homosexuals? So I think what you're saying is right, though. It's like all of this stuff is an effort to create a new moral realism on a postmodern foundation. And then it's common, for example, in a lot of these kinds of intellectual circles, modern intellectual circles, or postmodern intellectual circles, to say everything is a social construct. More recently, they talk about how gender is a social construct. So there's really no such thing as male or female, or it's just sort of it's just a matter of how you perceive it or how you create for you, or what you create for yourself, right? So that's a somewhat postmodern concept. But then the moral realism aspect is, well, you've got to embrace and accept, LGBTQism, as a social good. It's not enough to simply be value neutral, so you don't care, or certainly you can't oppose any of that. You've got to accept that as a positive good, even if it's purely socially constructed.
All right. Well, I think that's all I have for now. Thanks again, Keith. It's always a pleasure having you on. This is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast, signing off.